evening, and tonight's shir is being sponsored, dedicated in the honor of the yard site of the late Mrs. Wendy Teller, Yiddish name Hayadina Bas Shol, and her yard site is it's the second yard site, I believe, yes? Pinchas? Second yard site?
I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. Right. So let's go straight to the questions.
Diane, you're very quiet.
Yeah. Go straight to the questions. First of all, about on Yom Tov, we all would into peeling lots of fruit and vegetables. So the question about peeling on Yom Tov. Can you use a peeler for peeling fruit and vegetables on Shabbos and on Yom Tov? So now the Shmir Shabbos Golchoso brings the view of the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer was the Sochat Shover. He also wrote a sefer called Eglei Tal, which is on the Lamates Malachas, and he was a contemporary perhaps of the Tzemach Tzedek a little bit later. He strongly takes the view that if it's an edible peel, then it's not a question of boirer altogether. The whole issue here is you are allowed to you're allowed to boirer is a malacha, but if it's a derech achila, if it's a manner of eating, then it's okay. So he sees an edible peel, but you remove an edible peel, so that's not called boirer altogether. It doesn't come into the category of boirer, and on that basis, even though a peeler could be seen as a special implement, specialized for separating one from the other, but he says still that it's not boirer altogether. It's all food. You're separating food from food, and therefore it's not considered boirer. And so he allows you to use an apple peeler or a potato peeler to peel apples. He says you are allowed to use those on Yom Tov, on Shabbos, sorry. So now then, what you have in front of you, however, is from a sefer called Shabbos Halacha from Rabbi Yukosiel Forkash. He's now published his fourth volume on Hilchos Shabbos. So I'm going to run through what he says here. So this is in his second volume. Yeah. So he writes the following: Devarim shenitan le'oichelom mibli sheyakalfum. Things which can be eaten without being peeled, like apples and like cucumbers. If most people eat them with the peels, but once the peel is removed, people are not going to eat apple peels on their own, not going to eat cucumber peels on their own. So there are many poskim who allow us to peel them on Shabbos without the limitations of boirer. And you would be allowed to use a peeler also. And you'd be allowed to peel them even not for immediate use, even for delayed use. However, he says, if the one who's peeling them is a istinis, it's a fussy eater who won't eat without the peeling, even though other people will eat the same with the peel, so he should be machmir, not to use a peeler, etc., etc. So he brings the first view that using a peeler for apples, if you are used to eating apples with the peel, he says you are allowed to peel them with a peeler on Shabbos. He then says, Le'idor Gisa, that's the second paragraph. On the other side, there are Gedolei HaPoskim who are more machmir on this. And therefore, he recommends that Haroitze Lotzes Yidei Kol Hadeyas, if you want to be covered from all opinions, then you shouldn't be using a peeler, I guess, subject to the dinim of, because it is a question of boirer. He says, then at the bottom of the page, he says, if you are in a rush to cover a lot of ground, to do a lot of peeling, lots of apples, in a rush, whether it's or you're in a rush, in time, let's go on to the next page. So you should, so he says, if you do want to use a peeler. So peel off also a fair bit of the fruit also, not just the peel. It should be quite a bit of the fruit, noticeable part of the fruit. In other words, more than just the bare peel. This is all said, he says, by a fruit or a vegetable where most people do eat them with the peels. The kind of fruit or vegetable which most people will not eat them without being peeled. So, for example, a carrot. Although you can eat a carrot with the peel, but most of us won't eat a carrot unpeeled. Therefore, you wouldn't be allowed to use a peeler for that. So, to summarize this, he says, one who wants to peel a cucumber or apple, not subject to the limitations of boyer, like for the peeler or for a delayed use, don't do that. It should be machmir. If you want to rely on the mekilim, it's only such a fruit which most people will eat it without peeling. Okay, so that's basically the answer. That there is room to be makel, to be more lenient with the use of a peeler for peeling apples on Shabbos, but he recommends to take a strict view not to do so. Let's move on then. Point 2 in our question then, what about on Pesach? Even so, we just read before about the istiness. A person who's a very fussy eater wouldn't eat without peeling. So then for him, subjectively, it becomes an issue of boirer. So the same thing would apply for Pesach. Since on Pesach we are more fussy about peels, so then we shouldn't be using a peeler on Shabbos on Pesach. Having said that, what about Yom Tov, not Shabbos? So then on Yom Tov, on the contrary, it's recommended to use a peeler because the rules of boirer for Yom Tov are different to Shabbos. The rules of Yom Tov, of boirer on Yom Tov, is to use the simplest route, the one which is the least effort. And therefore, if it's quicker, it's less effort to use a peeler than to use a knife, then use a peeler by all means on Yom Tov. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Every year comes the last day of Pesach. The whole Pesach will be very, very careful about Gebroks. Comes the last day of Pesach. So this is amongst all Chassidim who are machmer on Gebroks, but the last day of Pesach we're mekel. It's not only Chabad, you look in other forums, this is the general view. And the last day of Pesach, one is mekel. And the reason for this is, so in a sense that it's a day where there should be an achdus of all Yidden and not to be machmer. I'm more stricter than you. Okay. Question is, do you have to worry about the kalim, about not being able to use the same kalim next year because they were used for Gebroks? Let me stop a second before we get going to this question. What happens if chametz got mixed into sugar a week before Pesach and it got cooked together? So we know that bittul b'shishim works before Pesach, and therefore you'd be allowed to have that sugar on Pesach because it's bottled b'shishim before Pesach. Now, what happened if the same happened on Pesach? If one drop of chametz fell into a whole pot of sugar, let's say on Pesach, so then there's no bittul b'shishim, and so the whole pot of sugar becomes usher. Sorry, but what happens next year? This bit of chametz, which is bottled b'shishim, on Pesach itself, there's no bittul. Bittul doesn't work on Pesach. But this same mixture, if it would happen a week after Pesach, would be bottled. So then, possibly you should say for next year, well, why should it be usher? It's been bottled before this Pesach. Or do you say no? Because the mixture happened on Pesach, and on Pesach the whole mixture became usher. Therefore, the whole thing should be, the keli should be usher. So there's two ways of looking at it. Okay, so this is, I've got here from the Sefer Piskei Teshuvos. Some say take the view that by next year you don't have to worry about it. Some say that you do have to worry about it. that the problem kind of reawakens next year. And the minig would be if it had been osur, if there had been a crumb of chometz mixed into a kompot, let's say, and the keli had become osur, you wouldn't use it next Pesach without kashering. That's true. But when it comes to gibroks, we're talking about a different thing. We're not talking about chometz, chas v'shalom. We're talking about a chumrah being extremely, how do you say, conscientious, way beyond. And on that basis, although if it were mamash chometz mixed in with a kompot on Pesach, I'd say you should kasher that pot before next year. But here with gibroks, one can take the view because it's such a remote, I don't know what the right word is, the remote, far out chumrah, therefore one doesn't need to kasher. So there are different views of this. Some say that because between this Pesach and next Pesach there's 12 months, therefore you don't have to worry about it because there's an opinion of the Chacham Tzvi based upon the dinim of Yain Nesech that once the whole issue is the taste which is absorbed in the keli. So there's that view that after 12 months, the taste in the keli has become totally, irrelevant, so totally bottled, has nothing to talk about. So some say that because between one Pesach and the next, there's 12 months, but that's not always mamish to the day. So there's room to be machmir, there's room to be mekel, and bottom line is, what is our minig? So here we have from the Sefer Oitzim Minhagei Chabad, Achilas Hashiruya B'Kli HaPesach HaRegilim. The minig in Chabad, by the base in the Rebbe's house, they would use for Pesach, for the last day of Pesach, they used the same dishes which they used the middle days of Pesach, the earlier days of Pesach, wouldn't kasher for the next year. And even though sometimes there aren't full 12 months from Pesach to next Pesach, weren't worried about it. So that remains the bottom line, basically, in Chabad, that we don't worry about kashering the kalim from gibroks before using them next year. So we are a bit relaxed on that. Okay. Let's go to one more post-Pesach question. And that is, one family, they made, before Pesach, or during Pesach, they made some kind of sweet, mixing mashed banana and crushed nuts. But it's after a while, that same mixture becomes a bit mushy. And they had some leftovers for after Pesach. So they took some oats after Pesach and they mixed it into that sweet. And then they're asking the question, what is the bracha on this sweet? Which is a mixture, as I said, of banana, mashed banana, crushed nuts, and now it's got some oats. Is the bracha mazonis or is it shahakal, etc.? So we do know that there's this principle that in a mixture, mazonis becomes the dominant feature, but that's only when it's put in for taste. But if it's just put in there for structure, to give it some kind of more, if the word is viscosity, so then it doesn't become mazonis. This is what you have here from the Alter Rebbe's Seder Birchas HaNe'enim. When do we say that dogon becomes the ikir? When it's put in for taste. But if it's only put into color or just to make it hold together, it should be lit thicker. So then you can ignore we ignore the grain content and we make the bracha as if it wasn't there. That's the reason why, let's say, fish cakes, which are made with matzah meal, they don't become mazonos because the matzah meal is put there just to give it body, to hold it together. It's not to give it, not for the purpose of nourishment. In Diane Krauss from Manchester, in his book, he's got two sforim on brachas. The first one he called Mekoyer HaBracha, and the second one he called Tosfos Bracha. And in that sefer, in the first sefer, he takes the view that the bracha on licorice is mazonos because licorice has got flour in it. These licorice chewy sticks. In the second volume, in the Tosfos Bracha, he retracts from that, and he quotes a letter from Kalden and Bowser, the manufacturers, where they confirm that the reason why they put in the flour into the licorice is not for taste, but it is for body. Since we're talking about brachos on food, I'd like to share with you. I know I spoke about this at the Kinus Torah on Pesach here in London, but I'd like to just share with you here, at least briefly. It's something which had bothered me for many, many years, and that is, well, you have a cookie, which is made of flour, and it's got in it sugar. A classic example is chocolate brownies. Check in the kitchen, what's the recipe? There's a massive amount of sugar vis-a-vis the flour. So now, if you're on a diet, you only eat one kazayis of chocolate brownie. Now, what bracha achrona is it? Is it al hamichyo or ber nefoshes? Because half of this thing isn't flour at all. So you only had a half a kazayis of grain. Or do you say no? The grain becomes the dominant feature, and just like the presence of grain makes the whole thing mezoinus, so perhaps the presence of grain makes the whole thing into an al hamichya also. This is the question. So here we have in Alter Rebbe's Siddur, in Birchas HaNe'enin, he says the first view is that if you have a mixture of grain with honey, so then the grain becomes the ikir and becomes mezoinus and en sholosh b'al hamichya. So long as there's actual grain and not just the taste, it becomes al hamichya. V'yesh oimrim. Now, second paragraph. There are those who say that on this mixture, it would not become warrant al hamichya. Ela imkein yesh b'tarovis kazayis dogim b'chiachilas pras. It only be if the ratio is that there's one kazayis in the amount you would eat in a kriachilas pras. Let's say that's 6 3 eggs. If it's 1 to 6, in other words, 1 to 5 actually. Yeah. Some say that when does the grain dominate to make the whole mixture al hamichya? Only if it's a 1 to 5 ratio. But if it's more, if the grain is more diluted, let's say 1 to 6, 1 to 7, then it's still mezoinus, but it's not al hamichya. Okay. So meanwhile, according to this, the bracha on the chocolate brownies, which is, even if it's twice sugar to grain, it's still not 1 to 6. It's less than 1 to 5. It's more than 1 to 5. Therefore, according to this, the bracha on you'd say al hamichya for the chocolate brownies. Now let's go on to the next quote, which is in Birchas, and that was in Perek Gimel, and now we're in Perek Ches. So here he writes, if you've got a mixture of flour of grain and let's say flour of kidneys, yeah, of beans, it could be it's hamoitzi because the grain is the main thing. But when it comes for the after bracha, it would only be warrant birchas hamazon if there's a ratio of kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. Mistake there. Should be a samach. That seems to be the same as what he said back in Perek Gimel. But v'yesh oimrim she'ein mevorich birchas hamazon ad sheyochel kol hapras. The second opinion says no. You can't make a birchas hamazon, the full birchas hamazon, on this mixture unless you eat a whole pras. So if you've eaten the volume of 3 3 eggs, so inevitably you've eaten the kazayis of grain. So according to this approach, it looks like that on the chocolate brownie, you wouldn't make a bracha ala michya on 1 kazayis unless you ate 2 or 3 kazayis, and then you will inevitably have eaten a kazayis of grain. So here we've got a contradiction between the two places. This is I think it's very clear. The contradiction seems to be very clear. So this contradiction bothered me for many years. And last year I looked at it more carefully, and I think I've come to a clear explanation. in this case, in the first scenario, he's talking about grain mixed with honey. In the second scenario, he's talking about flour of grain mixed with flour of beans. There's a difference here, two different types of mixtures. Flour with honey, sugar, whatever it may be, or flour with flour. Why does that make any difference? So now let's scroll down. Here we have, this is where it's in Shulchan Aruch, I think it's Kuf Samach Zayin, and here we have the Magen Avraham, who talks about he's differentiating whether it's mixed with flour or with other things. And here the next quote is from the Alter Rebbe in the Luach Bechasanen, and I just explained the logic here. Flour in other things, in flour in a chocolate brownie, let's say, flour with sugar, the flour is recognizable, that its presence is there. Therefore, even though it's 1 to 5, it's still noticeable and it dominates. But when it's flour with flour, it's flour of grain and flour, tapioca flour, whatever it may be. Flour with flour, because it's a power, but they're similar, they have similar properties, similar tastes, similar structure. Therefore, it becomes negligible. It's more easy to ignore flour in flour than to ignore flour in sugar. So again, in Perek Gimel, he says when it's 1 to 5 of flour in sugar, in honey, then it's ala michya. In Perek Ches, he says if the same would be flour with flour, it would not be warrant al hamichya or bechasamos if it was without sugar, because it's flour with flour. Then I wouldn't say an al hamichya unless you ate so much of the mixture that you for sure ate a kazayis of flour in the mixture. That seems to be very clear, the answer. So back to the chocolate brownies, it remains that you would make an al hamichyan of a kazayis of the brownies, and it doesn't need to be a kazayis or one kazayis of the mixture is enough to make an al hamichyan. Let's move on. I got this question from a shliach somewhere in the former Soviet Union, and the situation is that, as we all know, that there's every time there's a person who's not so frum, who passes away, there's always a struggle. Is it going to be a cremation or is it going to be a burial? And it's a big achievement that you manage to save a Jewish body from being cremated, and instead it's buried halacha. The problem is that in many of these places, they don't have a dedicated Jewish burial ground. They have a dedicated Jewish cemetery. They don't even have a dedicated plot area within the Goyish cemetery. So it can be that you're burying a Jewish body right next to it could be even crosses and whatever, what have you. I must tell you, I was once in Alma-Ata, where the Rebbe's father is buried, and walking from the entrance of the cemetery till where Reb Leivik is buried is about a 5-minute walk. It was really, I felt terrible, because there's all these Goyish graves with busts and statues and symbols, etc. And then after 5 minutes walk, there you find Reb Leivik's burial plot. And you felt that it's like a golus and a golus and a golus in such a, that's where it's buried. So here the question is, they don't have, in many of these places, they don't have the option of burying them in a Jewish cemetery. What can be done to mitigate the issue of burying them somewhere else, burying them in a Goyish cemetery? So what's the issue here? So here we have the halacha of ein koivrim rosha eitzel tzadik, afilu rosha chamur eitzel rosha kal, v'chein ein koivrin tzadik v'kosher beinini eitzel chosid muflik. There is an issue of not burying a rosha next to a tzadik, and certainly like a Yehudi, with any Yehudi, one wouldn't want to bury them next to one another. One's presence could disturb the other. There is a shtickle solution, and that is to put up a fence. And that's sometimes allowed, that's sometimes done, and that would mitigate this issue. And I just saw now in the Minchas Elazar talks about this issue, and he says that's why they build a oihel for tzaddik. This is basically to isolate that the tzaddik shouldn't be disturbed by his resting place, so the tzaddik shouldn't be disturbed by the other people's bodies who are buried nearby. So the one interesting factor which I noticed when I was in Russia and in Ukraine, that there it's very popular that they have family plots and they have metal railings around them. Nothing to do with Yiddishkeit, just wherever it is. I saw many times cemeteries as you're driving through the countryside. You saw many times they had these family plots surrounded with metal railings. And actually around Bleivik's place also, there's a metal railing all the way around. And so that would mitigate, though it's not a proper Beis HaChaim dedicated, but this would be the one way of course, you can't put up the railings necessarily before the burial, but as soon as possible to put up railings, in that way it wouldn't have this business of Rosh Eitzel Sadik. Let's move on to the next question. So question 7 is that we have a room which was a bathroom, but now we've removed all the porcelain, the bath and the toilet seat, etc., and now it's used as a storeroom. Does this room require a mezuzah? This is the question we're going to deal with now. So here we have in front of us the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Pei Dalet. So it's talking really in the rules, halachas of Shema, where you wouldn't say Shema in a bathhouse. But here he says, in passing, he throws in this. If there was a change in the structure of the bathroom, they removed the stove which they would have in the bathroom then, and they made it into a regular room. So the Mishnah Berurah is very clear that if you did a structural change to remove the features of a bathroom, and now it's become a regular room, then you would put up a mezuzah with a brocha, etc. Let's move on. Excuse me just a minute, I'll be back in a minute. Sorry about that. Okay, let's move on to the next question, point 8. And that is, we have, when we take out the Sefer Torah on Yom Tov, so we say Hashem Hashem Keil Racham V'Chanun, after which we have this Ribono Shel Olam where we mention our name and our mother's name. Now, on Yom Tov, we had the Shvi Shel Pesach was a Shabbos. So then becomes a question when the Siddur says clearly that when Yom Tov is on Shabbos, we don't say Hashem Hashem. It remains unclear what happens about the Ribono Shel Olam. Is that prayer said when Yom Tov is on Shabbos, or do you, since you're not saying your Gimel Serachamim, therefore automatically you drop the prayer also? I must tell you that this is already going back 350 years ago. You've got Ramosha Zakuta in the Ramaz, who already mentions that you don't, even though you don't say Hashem Hashem, you still say the Ribono Shel Olam on a Shabbos. And there's been to and fro in different Sfarim whether they are dealt together or they are two separate things. So now what we have here So we have here a sikha from Tafshin and Beis. We're talking here about emulating the Nesiim, emulating the Rebbe. And he says, emulating the Rebbe, let's take a look over here. This is the third paragraph. So if you get all what you mean, you should emulate the Rebbe. So the Rebbe says, don't be so surprised. You have something similar every Yom Tov when you open up the Oren. If it's on a weekday, so you see what he's saying, the Rebbe is saying over here, that you have this Yirotzen, or Rebbeinu Shalom, this tefillah which we say every Yom Tov. And if it's on a weekday, you've said that you'd give Mizah Rachmim, which obviously implies if it was not a weekday, if it was Shabbos, then you wouldn't say you give Mizah Rachmim, but you'd still say the tefillah. So this is a tough human base. This is the way they've presented the Sikha. And so you see, from here we see that it looks like you would say the tefillah on Yom Tov, which is on the Shabbos. I'm just going to read here. This is from the Pischei Tshuva. He writes the following. This question was put to the Ramosha Zakuto, and he says you shouldn't say Ein Lo'im Lo'im B'Tfilas Yom Tov Klal, etc. Shagam, he writes the following. Shagam im chol Yom Tov b'Shabbos, shoim berich shmei, loy nidchet tefillah zoi. That you wouldn't push aside this tefillah of Rebbeinu Shalom even when Yom Tov is on the Shabbos. So there are two views of this, but it looks like that the remains that you should be saying that the tefillah of Rebbeinu Shalom when Yom Tov is on the Shabbos. Not saying Hashem Hashem, but you would say the tefillah of Rebbeinu Shalom. Let's go to the next question. Okay. Now, so I got this question yesterday. Someone asked that they have a child was born, and there's a grandparent. Is it appropriate to give the name after a parent of a grandparent? And then, because let's say if I would have a child named after my mother, so then I'd be calling this child with my mother's name. Would that be appropriate or be not appropriate? So first of all, the idea of giving, and the way it was put to me was, the question was, perhaps it's better not to give a parent name after a parent, so as not to have the michshel, not to have the problem of how you're going to call that child, not with the with the parent's name. So first of all, it is definitely a Jewish minhag to try to give a name after a deceased parent. By the Sephardim even in their lifetime, by the Ashkenazim only after they passed away. So here we have, this is from a sefer called Ziv HaShemes, all about names. And he says that originally they used to give names of people named after the current event, like Noach, Yitzchak, etc., Moshe, after events which happened around their birth. But then the minhag has changed, and the name is given, we give names after parents. And then in the footnote we have here, he refers to Medrash Rabbah. Rabbi Yoshi says the earlier generations that their yichus, their lineage was more known. So then they would name according to current events. But our lineage is not so well known, and therefore we use the names as to kind of, I think it means to preserve the traceability of our lineage. Reb Shimon Gamliel says they used to have Ruach HaKodesh, so they would use names from the current events. We don't use Ruach HaKodesh, so we use the Shem Aviseinu. I also noticed, I don't remember which sefer I saw this. We have the 4 sons of Aaron. The oldest one was called Nadav. What was the grandfather? That Aaron's wife was Elisheva Bas Aminodov. So I saw a sefer which points out that Nadav, the son of Aaron, was named after Elisheva's father, Aminodov. So we saw already then you have this idea of naming after a grandfather. And throughout the generations, we can see you've got Moshel, you got the after Hillel the Nossi, Hillel, you got Shimon, Gamliel, Shimon. They use the names of the father the whole time, and the same thing with Rabbi Yehuda Nossi and Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya. You see the whole time they would give names of grandparents. Having said that, in other words, it's clear that it's a minhag Yisrael to use grandparents' names. Then the question is it appropriate to refer to call a child with the same name as one as to another way, as actually referring to them? So I had heard from Rabbi Tiefenbrunn, Aaron Tiefenbrunn, his father-in-law was Reb Sholem Ber Eichhorn. Reb Sholem Ber Eichhorn was a meshamish. He helped the Frierdiker Rebbe, who was, as you know, he was very disabled and limited with what he could do. So he needed to have someone to help him move, etc. And so Sholem Ber Eichhorn would help him. And the Rebbe never called him by his name, Sholem Ber. He always called him Eichhorn. Because the Rebbe's father was Sholem Ber, the Rebbe Rashab, therefore he always referred to him as Eichhorn. Last night someone also sent me a text that possibly from the Halberstam family, who were very, very close with the Rebbe's family, and the children would come into the Rebbe's house. But when there were children who had the names, the Rebbetzin, if they were, let's say, it was a Yosef Yitzchak or similar, who had the name of the Rebbetzins' parent, so she would never refer to them by name. She wouldn't call them Yosef Yitzchak, she would call them Ziskait, whatever, maybe she would use some other reference to avoid calling him by name. So here we've got, I mentioned many times the Sefer Piskei Teshuvos, and there's a follow-on from that. His son-in-law has put out a Sefer called Psokim Utshuvos, and here it's on he has this section of Kibbud Av V'Eim. So he says that to call after the father has passed away, you are allowed to call others with this name. But there are Yechidei Sgula, there are select individuals who were particular about that they would not refer to, they would not call someone by the name of their deceased father. So in the note 107, he quotes here that the Chassam Sofer had a son whose name was Reb Shmuel. He never called him Reb Shmuel. He called him Reb Wolf, because his father was, I think his name was Avram Shmuel Binyamin. But he called him Reb Wolf because the father was Reb Shmuel, and he wanted to avoid calling his son directly with his father's name. But Chazon Ish also had this, he wouldn't call people by his father's name, Shmaryahu, even though his father's passed away. And he says also by the Vishnitzer Rebbes, they also would change the name a little bit. They shouldn't be mamish calling the father's name. It just comes to mind that in the Beis Harav, it's mentioned the Rishimus, the Rebbe Rashab, even as he was a little boy, they called him Rashab, and they called the other brother Razor. They called them by the abbreviations. I'm just wondering whether that may have been also out of sensitivity. Tzemach Tzedek's father was Reb Shalom Shachner, so to call his grandson, to call him Sholem Ber, perhaps he wanted to avoid that, so he called him Rashab, and so on. That's what I'm suggesting. Okay, we've gone through our list for today, and wish you all a good Shabbos and an inspiring Chof Ches.
But lehalacha, one can call one's anicle like their father's name?
The halacha is that you can, yes, the halacha you can, and that you see that most people do so, and it's only Yechidei Sgula who are particular about this, to avoid this. But generally it's okay. But if you want, you can kind of change the name slightly. Instead of saying, in my case, my father's name was Sholem Ber, that's how he was known. But let's say I would call him Beryl or something like that. You can find another slight change. Let me just read this note and share with you. Yisrael Abu Chatzera was named after his grandfather Yaakov Abu Chatzera. because his father didn't want to name him with the same name. Is that why he was called Baba Sali? Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what I heard.
Okay. So then, you're talking about Yechidas Gula. Most people are not fussy about this, and it's la halacha, it's not necessary, but there is room to be machmir, and that's for Yechidas Gula. So, all right. You can put it on your bucket list for being one of the Yechidas Gula. Be careful about this also. Meanwhile, I wish you all a good Shabbos, and Bez Hashem will continue next week with whatever comes up during the week. Call to
Thank you very, very much. A good Shabbos.
and a good Chodesh.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Good Chodesh.
Good Shabbos. Shabbos.